First on BBC Two, we've the third in the series of Visions. Inventor Sir Clive Sinclair talks about his hopes and fears for the future.
I think for Britain, the 90s will be a period of choice. We can either choose to go with Europe, which means major investment in infrastructure, the rail, the roads, which means being a bit uncomfortable in the short term, but greatly to the long-term benefit. Or we can fail to do that and become a dismal backwater on the outer edge of Europe.
Sir Clive Sinclair is the man who, more than any other in Britain, has brought technology to the masses. The pocket calculator, the digital watch, the mini television, the affordable home computer. Others have developed the technology, but it was Sinclair who introduced us to a world of chips with everything and so prepared us for the way we now live and work. True, Sir Clive's genius as an innovator hasn't always been matched by his business acumen. Occasionally, he has spectacularly misjudged his market. But what has never been doubted is his vision. As the man who has shaped the electronic revolution of the last 2 decades, Sir Clive now looks forward to the next.
Sir Clive, given the extraordinary developments in technology that we've seen in recent years, is it your impression that we've come to the end of the story, at least for the moment, or that the 1990s could represent a new and perhaps even more exciting chapter?
No, I don't think it's the end of the story in any sense. There's maybe a pause in that we've seen a long period of exciting product innovations, and a lot of those stem from electronics coming into the consumer field. That may not have the same pace in the future, but I do believe, in fact, that there will be a lot of other areas that will be very exciting in terms of technology, resulting in new products. And biotechnology, of course, is coming along apace, but so is mechanical engineering sort of having a resurgence with new materials.
Well, we'll come on to those later, but I just wonder whether 20 years ago you would have predicted accurately that we would be at this stage now.
No, I certainly wouldn't. I think that it's quite remarkable how the path that technology takes, even though some things ought to be predictable, in fact, very often they're not, and the end result is quite different from what one expected.
In terms of speed or direction?
I think it's direction. In many ways, I think the world is more similar to the way it was 20 years ago than people thought it would be. There were a lot of predictions of sort of personal flying machines if you go back not very far in time, and none of these things have happened. Cars today are very much as they were 20 years ago, indeed perhaps 40 years ago. So in some ways, the change is very slight. In other ways, of course, video recorders and so on, it's dramatic.
One change, of course, that we do know that is going to happen in the 1990s is that Britain is going to be even more a part of Europe, partly because of 1992, but also geographically because of the Channel Tunnel. What do you think should be Britain's role in this new Europe?
I believe that we have got to resolve swiftly to take Europe very seriously indeed, or we're going to become a backwater. I don't believe that we can just simply take the sort of attitude we seem to be taking at the moment, that we'll pick and choose with the elements of Europe that suit us. I think that we could choose not to be part of Europe, clearly. That could be the case, and I think that would be a disaster. But if we're going to be part of Europe, as I certainly think we should, then we've got to be very wholehearted about it and change what seems to be an attitude of rather denigrating the European concept.
But what exactly will be our role? Will we be in Athens or Rome?
Well, we'll be a Frinton if we're not very careful. I think we've got to put our minds to it. We've got every possibility of being the lead, the connection, really, a connecting point to the outside world. William Rees-Mogg recently suggested that we'd be the natural link because we speak English and we've got sort of some contacts with America. The outside world might tend to approach Europe via us in many cases, as a matter of convenience.
So we'd be a sort of linguistic interface?
We could well be, and also a physical one in that London at the moment is the place that people naturally fly to from the outside world. Far and away the most important international airports are there. But if we continue to take this pathetic attitude over building the infrastructure in this country that we're doing at the moment, then we will lose that position, because people will realise that the Europe is the main thing, and why go via London?
What do you mean by this pathetic attitude to infrastructure?
Well, we're building a channel tunnel, fine, and we're squabbling about whether we'll build a decent high-speed train to it, and it's going to be a terrifying prospect that on one side of the tunnel you'll be able to travel at something approaching 200 miles an hour, maybe exceeding 200 miles an hour, the way France is advancing its train technology. And on this side you'll be tootling along at about 60. It'll be quite pathetic. And it won't do at all. If we're going to be part of Europe, we've got to plan for the 21st century, just as they are. There's a pan-European, very high-speed train system being built, and we're being left out of it because we're just not putting the investment in.
So in terms of high-speed transport, what should we be doing now?
Well, I believe that we should build trains to at least the standard the French are building, and it would be nice to try and compete and perhaps surpass them, to link up Scotland and Ireland and Wales to London and to the continent. I believe we should be much bolder in the links that we form. I don't think tunnels are ideal. They're a good first step. I think the tunnel will be over-occupied very swiftly. I'd like to see great bridges built, perhaps linking Ireland to England or Scotland, and a bridge across the Channel should perhaps be being planned at least. Instead of which we seem to have a very parochial view.
But this is the trouble with vision, isn't it? That vision actually requires nerve to implement it. Are you saying you don't see the political will or the public acceptance?
Well, I take the point you make there, that I don't think there is the political will at the moment, and I think there would be public acceptance, because the public sees at the moment a situation where we have a big balance of payments deficit. The government, in seeking to cure that, imposes crippling levels of interest. Now, those very high levels of interest are greatly damaging to our business prospects. France and Germany and Japan, the sort of leading economic success stories, achieve what they do by having very low rates of interest, so their industry can plan ahead for a long time and doesn't have to get a terrific return just to pay off the bank debt. And all this is imposed upon us because of the balance of payments deficit. Now, if the government imposed rather somewhat higher taxes, not that I'm normally in favour of high taxes, but in this case I am, somewhat higher taxes, and devoted the money to improving the infrastructure of the country, people, I think would feel wealthier. They feel better off because there's a better environment in which to live. The money effectively would be taken away from the purchase of consumer durables, such as, say, videotape recorders, which we have to import, and would be spent on internal expenditure, so it would in fact be adjusting the balance of payments at the same time.
But are you really sure there is that public acceptance? I mean, given the evidence that we see before us now, the people of Kent and their reluctance to have great chunks of their county dug up for high-speed rail links, and whenever there's a suggestion of a new motorway or a new airport, the public protest. It doesn't seem to be, on the face of it, that the public are prepared to make the sacrifice.
Nobody wants the motorway in their backyard, and it's always disruptive, and that has to be faced. Any change is difficult for some people. And I'm not pretending that these sort of changes are universally acceptable or accepted, but one has got to take the average, the common good, and some people will lose a bit, and there has to be a lot of attention to minimising that inconvenience, of course. But we can't. We've got to face that there has to be some change.
Can you then spell out the consequences if we're not prepared to make this even limited compromise?
I believe very severe indeed. We have a very poor position today in manufacturing terms compared with the continent, let alone with Japan. We've fallen behind very badly indeed. Now, we might, in the right environment, I'm sure we could put that right. One of the ways in which that can be put right fast is by foreign countries investing in our manufacturing capability here.
Which is already happening to a degree.
Which is. But it'll be choked off very rapidly if those countries believe that we're not going to be a major partner in Europe. If they don't believe the infrastructure is going to be there, they'll suddenly say, well, I'm not going to build my car factory in Scotland because I don't believe I'll be able to transport my cars efficiently to Germany or France, or where the market happens to be. So it's really a very serious prospect indeed. We could drop back very rapidly and very severely if we don't grasp the nettle.
And become what?
Well, what would happen is that because of the huge balance payments deficit that would arise, the pound would fall drastically. We would get into spiralling inflation. This could only be checked off by some sort of political measures, which would be extremely unpleasant. We could have a major recession, a really major one, and a very rapidly declining standard of living, which would be tragic, but it's quite possible, I believe. And it's the other side of the coin, which would be a very attractive opportunity, which we have.
But you're saying that if we don't grasp the opportunity now, we become a picturesque backwater, a
Yes.
Disney theme park, in effect.
Yes. Well, I don't think it'd be quite as much fun as a Disney theme park.
Is there not the possibility, though, that if your vision were realised, that the southeast would, on the one hand, benefit disproportionately, perhaps, but also suffer disproportionately in terms of the environmental disruption?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you need, of course, the link to the Channel Tunnel, and that is disruptive. But what I would very much like to see is a very high-speed rail link from London to extend that link up the east coast to Scotland, which could be combined with a decent motorway up the east coast, which we don't have. We have a very poor motorway structure compared with other countries, and we pay a price for that in the terms of the appalling road congestion we have, which has an economic price which is very high indeed. So you could combine the two, and if you build a very high-speed link up to Scotland, I think that people would start to think in terms of Scotland as being very close to the continent instead of being very far away from it.
But the south and east would then become a corridor, in effect.
Yes, but it would be really could be it'd be really rather like Venice was. It was a corridor in the past, if you like, perhaps.
The trouble is, isn't it, that there is, I think, in the public mind a feeling that, particularly in this decade, when it seems that the environment and environmental considerations are going to be uppermost, that technology in some way has been to blame. Technology coupled with excessive consumerism. How do you counter that?
Well, economic activity is perhaps always the cause of environmental problems. The Elizabethans cut down so many trees in Britain to build their fleets and so on that they caused great problems then, and they turned to coal, and that gave problems. So we've had these problems for centuries. It's not a new thing to have environmental problems, and it's not in a particular feature of new technology. But the point to realise, of course, is that it's technology that can solve the problem. We don't solve the problem by saying, well, right, let's all stop doing what we've been doing all this time, because we can't, in a sense. We've still got to heat our houses. What we must do is to seek technical solutions to the problems that our lifestyles have caused. Those are going to have to be quite radical changes, because this, in my opinion, the carbon dioxide greenhouse effect is a very serious prospect indeed, and we can't just ignore that. We have to accept a major change for that.
Well, give me an example, in the 1990s, how technology is going to help solve the problems that technology in part has created.
Well, one of the things, of course, that one of the problems, one of the fears I have, if I can just move sideways a bit, is that we are taking steps which we believe, or the public is being persuaded to believe perhaps, are going to solve the problems, when in fact they're really not. For example, unleaded petrol. People have got the impression that because they're using unleaded petrol, suddenly this is nice for the environment. Well, in the first place, unleaded petrol, as you know, pollutes very severely. It's lost one pollutant, lead, but it's got many others in it, which are very serious indeed. And on top of which, it's pumping out carbon dioxide, whatever you do to the petrol. Now, there's a suggestion that the common market is certainly going to go towards legislation such as they've had in America for many years, that will cut down on some of those pollutants. But again, it won't affect the carbon dioxide. It might in fact make it worse, because the engines will be less efficient. So it's only going to be through quite dramatic change that we can solve the problem. In my opinion, we've got to go to something like electric cars, which have got to become more or less universal. We've got to go to power stations that don't themselves pump out carbon dioxide. Atomic power, of course, is one approach, but we have many others, particularly in this country, that are available to us. We have tidal power, which could provide probably 10%, maybe as much as 20% of our total energy requirements, and wind power could provide a considerable amount.
Well, let's talk about the electric car, because clearly this is an issue dear to the hearts of those of us in the south and east. Now, the C5, the ill-fated C5, was nevertheless meant to lead on to something very much more ambitious, am
Yes.
I right? It
Yes.
was essentially a four-seater, 80-mile-an-hour car with a 300-mile range.
That's it.
Could you build that now, given
Yes.
unlimited investment, obviously?
Yes, that's right.
The technology does exist.
Yes, it does. The problem that we faced was that we didn't have the funds to get into a full-fledged car. The cost of that is huge. The idea was that C5 would be a stepping stone towards that. If that had been successful, we could have ploughed back the funds into what we called C15, which is a full-range car. Of course, C5 was not accepted and wasn't sufficiently successful anyway. Now, C15, the full-range car, or full inverted commas range car, as you say, 300 mile range at 80 miles an hour speed, was entirely feasible. We did a complete design study, and that could be built today. The problem is really that the people who are most able to build it, the major car companies, with the best will in the world, aren't going to suddenly scrap all their factories and build a completely new type of car. And indeed, whenever you get this sort of change, it doesn't tend to be the existing companies that create it. It has to come really perhaps from outside to start with.
So are we going to be driving these cars by the year 2000?
Well, I'd like to say we are, but it's going to take more than just economic factors, really, because the scale of entry, the barriers to entry in the car business is so huge that it is very difficult to see outsiders building cars efficiently, from scratch. So really it has to be the car companies. But that may happen because California is proposing to ban petrol cars and by sometime in the next century. And so there will be quite a lot of political pressure on car companies, and certainly car companies like General Motors have put in a remarkably good technical work in this field. General Motors are excellent in the work they've done in this field. They know how to do it.
Well, I was going to say, given the public response to unleaded petrol, you would think that any car company would see a tremendous potential in introducing an electric car.
Yes, but a terrible danger for them, because supposing they brought out electric cars and everyone said, yes, that's what we want, we don't want petrol cars anymore, they could find themselves in an awful bind, and that's why it's difficult to see how we get there from here via the existing car companies. They have so much invested, it's very hard for them to switch over.
Can we move forward to perhaps even beyond the 1990s indeed? You are very keen indeed, one of the companies that you have now set up is working on artificial intelligence. Now that's a wonderful jargon word, but what will it mean to us?
Strictly speaking, Sinclair Research is working on artificial intelligence. That's one of the sort of long-term goal, and Animatic, which is wafer-scale integration, is a sort of enabling technology for that, if you like. What I'm interested in there, and what the purpose behind that is to start to supplement and eventually completely complement human intelligence. Down the road somewhere, we'll be able to build machines which are as intelligent, indeed perhaps more intelligent than we are. That's to say, we'll be able to talk to them, hold a perfectly normal conversation with them. So they'll be able to start to take over from us in many fields which we see as purely human preserves at the moment. Now, this is necessary if we're to continue to increase our wealth, because we've run out of fields in which we replace sort of men's muscle power, so that we no longer have many people employed in manufacturing industries, fairly automated. And we can't continue to increase our wealth by shedding people from manufacturing and getting them into the service industries much further, because we've come to the end of that. So we need to start replacing people who are using their minds to make a living, or rather to complement them. So to take a sort of extreme example, one day we would like to be able to have doctors that are completely automatic, if you like, that we could talk to. And it's not. Would
it still be a doctor?
Yes, indeed. There's no reason why it shouldn't do all the function of a doctor. But the reason why we've got to do this, in my opinion, is that the demand for medical assistance, the demand for teaching and so on, is quite beyond our abilities just as humans to meet. Ideally, we'd like to have a tutor for each child, not 1 to 30. Ideally, we'd like to have a doctor available to each family. Certainly, we'd like to have some sort of nursing facility available for each old person, perhaps, at some stage. And this can't be done. We haven't enough people. So we have to have artificial intelligence in due course.
But are you saying that at some time around the year 2000, perhaps a little after that, that I will be sending my child not off to school, but into her room to look at a television screen. And if I feel ill, that I won't go to the doctor, that I will consult the television screen also.
Yes, that's right. Not quite as soon as that, perhaps. I think about the end of the century we'll begin to have that capability in the laboratory, in principle. We'll have machines that are beginning to compete with human beings in intelligence. It'll take quite a long time after that to learn how to use them. So it's not just around the corner, but it's not, nor is it as far off as some people would suppose. And yes, indeed, you would do that. I'm sure you would still have schools, in the sense that I think children need schools for social reasons, but I think a lot of the education would be undertaken on a one-to-one basis with a very patient, though inhuman teacher.
So what jobs will those children be doing?
Well, there will be no shortage of jobs, and the problem will be that there will be a shortage of people to perform them. So either we'll be replacing, we'll be supplementing people because we won't have enough of them, if you like.
It is, though, isn't it, a very impersonal world that we are talking about, and this has always been the problem with technology. If one looks back historically, the car insulates us from our fellow travellers, it cocoons us. The television is blamed for killing conversation. The telephone avoids the necessity to talk to people face to face.
Yes.
Even going back further than that, the wash house in the village was traditionally the place, the venue for all the social intercourse. That was removed as soon as washing machines were invented. What you are predicting is even more frightening than that.
It is worrying in that sense, I agree. And I think, though, that we're very good socially at sort of inventing ways to overcome that problem, even if there are any bingo holes at times. That we do, in fact, very much feel the need for social intercourse, and that therefore I do think that schools will remain, even though theoretically they could disappear. I think offices will remain, even though theoretically they could disappear. We will continue to meet socially.
But doesn't it frighten you personally, that idea?
Yes, it does. I think that's right, and I regret that I would much rather travel on a train than travel in a car, but for the very reason that I'm traveling with other people and it's more pleasant. So I think it is worrying, but at the same time, we do seem to overcome this all the time. We find ways of changing. I mean, the theme parks you mentioned earlier on. A bit dismissively perhaps, but they do bring people together in a sort of social environment. So people do clearly have that need to gather, and they find ways of doing it.
So you think we will gather, but it'll be purely socially?
Yes, I think that more and more. Well, I think even business, as I say, people go to offices even so sometimes they don't need to.
It'll be business lunches and bingo halls.
Yeah, not quite as bad as that.
The other aspect, of course, is a slightly hackneyed one now, is the Big Brother fear. Now, to an extent, it hasn't happened, certainly in terms of 1984, but it has happened already in one regard, and I'm thinking about the stock exchange, where computers are now overriding brokers and deciding whether to buy or sell. I wonder to what extent that is going to be a sign of the times of the 1990s.
I think it is a danger, yes. There's been a lot of talk of that computer programming not being the cause of crashes, but I can't believe that. It has to be. You're bound, because programs are fairly simple things at the moment. They're bound to take sort of action in a fairly stampede fashion at times, and so there are considerable dangers in that. If you link all the banks and if you link all the booking offices and things, and your technology crashes, then the result is much more severe than if a single office went down in the past. And so we have to be aware of that and design our systems very, very carefully. But I think we are aware of that, and there will be hiccups, there will be problems. But I'm an optimist, I suppose, and I believe we'll cope with them.
And do you believe, some people used to fear that increased technology, advanced technology, was going to mean greater unemployment. It doesn't seem to have happened yet.
I think we've been going through a period of increased unemployment as we go through the period of change. The period of change I'm thinking of is the one in which we shed people from manufacturing industry.
Yes.
We had about 40% in manufacturing at the end of the war, and it's going to go down to about 10% perhaps very shortly. I mean, it's less than 20% now.
But that was an unemployment that was, in a sense, was already there, wasn't it?
Well, it was a change. It was just as 150 years ago we came off the land, and all that employment. There was then a period of unemployment as we went into manufacturing. So there's been a period of unemployment as we've come out of manufacturing into the service industries. But that's coming to an end, and then I believe that the service industries are perfectly capable of mopping up everybody, or providing employment for everyone. And so I don't see unemployment as a problem in the future, as long as we have a wise political structure. Clearly, if we turn our backs on Europe, you could see massive unemployment.
Well, clearly part of that structure nationally is going to be our educational system. I wonder to what extent you feel that our schools are equipped to meet the challenge of the 1990s.
Well, clearly they have not met it sufficiently in the past. We have not been producing as many engineers, I believe, as we need. There has been a tendency to reduce the number of engineers and scientists produced, and I think that, and obviously that has been a response to some degree to demand, but I fear that we're not persuading enough high-caliber engineers and scientists to teach in schools to produce the next generation of students in those fields, and this is a personal fear, and I'm not well qualified to talk about it, but that's a suspicion I have from what little I see, and I do believe that education, the standard of education in the world we're coming into, will have to be higher than in the past, considerably higher, not lower. We're going to need many more technically aware people.
What about that old-fashioned concept, the pursuit of excellence? Do you sometimes think we've lost sight of that?
I think we have in this country. There's the educational world, from what I see of it, has seemed to have the belief that they've got to treat everybody on the same basis. Now, of course, where somebody is perhaps got a lot of learning difficulties, they believe they've got to give them special treatment. But I think we equally need to give special treatment to somebody who's got perhaps a very agile mind, because if they've got a very agile mind and they're kept in the same class as people with less agile mind, that mind can atrophy. They can become problem children, perhaps. And so that's from the point of view of the child, we need to consider them carefully. But also from the point of view of society, we need to get the best from each individual, because we're going to need these high caliber people very much in the future.
Sir Clive, the decade that we've been looking at, from what you've been saying, if we accept your vision, if we implement it, will certainly be a more prosperous Britain for us, and therefore presumably a more comfortable and a faster nation altogether. I wonder whether, though, the world will necessarily be better in the widest sense.
I think the world is going to be better in the coming years, because we're going to see, I believe, a decline in sovereignty. I know that there's one or two people around who are afraid of the loss of sovereignty, and I can understand that and sympathise with it. But I think in another sense it's a very good thing, that as you link nations in the way that Europe's becoming linked, and indeed as the world is becoming linked by the globalisation of business, the sort of old-fashioned sovereignty of national sort of military powers and so on becomes absurd. You start to have to break down barriers. You've got to start to think whether having different currencies in different countries really makes any sense. I can foresee a time, perhaps within the 90s, when Europe and America start to get together and say, well, shouldn't we be thinking in terms of a global currency under the World Bank or something?
But in terms of technology, you do seem to have an unbounded faith in science. Do you actually ever see any limit at all to technological advance?
No, absolutely none. There's no limit to which, to the degree to which science can serve us and increase wealth. Of course, it can be a danger as well as a benefit. But that's up to us. But there's certainly no limit.
So the choice is ours.
Yes, it is.
Sir Clive, thank you.